The most dangerous words a husband can ever say are not shouted in anger. They're spoken with a smile, because that's when he truly believes them. I learned that lesson on a rainy Friday evening on Bainbridge Island, just after the sun disappeared behind the gray waters of Puget Sound. My name is Adrian Mercer, and for years I believed everything in life had a price. Loyalty had a price. Respect had a price. Silence had a price. Even peace came with terms and conditions. That belief built my empire. It protected me from disappointment. It made me one of the most feared businessmen on the West Coast. But there was one thing I never realized I had already priced without ever writing it down. My marriage. The house overlooked the water, wrapped in cedar trees that muffled every sound except the rain tapping against the windows. Naomi loved that sound. She always said it made the house feel alive. I barely noticed it anymore. That evening, several of my senior partners had gathered in my private study after dinner. The negotiations had gone better than expected. Glasses clinked. Low laughter filled the room. Expensive bourbon. Expensive watches. Expensive opinions. Everything exactly where I wanted it. Naomi had greeted everyone with the same quiet grace she always carried. She made sure every guest felt welcome before disappearing toward the kitchen. None of us questioned it. We had all become accustomed to her invisible perfection. She simply made life easier. I leaned back in my chair as one of the men joked that marriage had softened me. Another laughed and asked whether love had finally become my greatest investment. I remember smiling before answering without giving the words a second thought. This love was just another deal to me. A few men laughed. One even raised his glass. Someone muttered that every successful marriage was basically a business arrangement anyway. I shrugged as if we had settled some obvious truth. You learn early enough, I added. Feelings fade. Deals last longer. More laughter. Someone changed the subject. Another deal. Another acquisition. Another city. Another victory. The conversation moved on. Mine certainly did. I never looked toward the hallway. I never noticed the reflection in the glass door. I never saw Naomi standing there with a serving tray balanced perfectly in both hands. She didn't drop it. She didn't gasp. She didn't interrupt us. She didn't even make a sound. She simply stood there for one long heartbeat before quietly turning away. I didn't know any of that. What I noticed instead was how smoothly the rest of the evening unfolded. Fresh coffee appeared exactly when it was needed. Dessert arrived warm. Empty glasses disappeared before anyone asked. Naomi smiled at every guest. She thanked them for coming. She wished each of them a safe drive home. When the front door finally closed and the last set of headlights disappeared down the winding driveway, I loosened my tie and walked into the kitchen expecting to find her reading beside the island with a cup of tea like she usually did. Instead, every dish had already been washed. Every light except one had been turned off. The kettle was clean. The counters were spotless. Upstairs, our bedroom door was slightly open. Naomi sat near the window, looking out toward the dark water. She smiled when I walked in. It was warm enough to fool anyone else. Long night? I asked. A productive one, she answered softly. Then she closed the book on her lap, wished me good night, and turned off her bedside lamp. I had no idea that nothing in our house had changed. And absolutely everything had. The next morning the rain returned before sunrise, soft enough to disappear into the sound of the waves below the cliffs. I woke to the familiar scent of fresh coffee drifting through the bedroom, exactly the way it had every morning for nearly 7 years. Nothing seemed different. My suit was hanging beside the closet door, freshly pressed. My watch rested beside my wallet. Even the tie I had planned to wear for an afternoon meeting had already been matched with the charcoal jacket I preferred. Naomi had always noticed details before I did. I walked downstairs expecting the same quiet smile that had greeted me every morning since we moved into the house. Instead, I found breakfast waiting on the dining table without her. The eggs were warm. The toast was still crisp. Fresh fruit had been arranged with the same care she always gave everything she touched. A folded note rested beside my coffee cup. It contained only 4 words. Meeting starts at 9. No heart. No smile. No signature. Practical. Efficient. I almost laughed, assuming she had simply been busy. A few minutes later, she entered from the back garden carrying a small basket of herbs she had collected despite the rain. She looked exactly the same. Same sweater. Same calm expression. Same graceful movements. Yet something invisible had shifted. Good morning, I said. She looked at me and smiled politely. Good morning, Mr. Mercer. I frowned without understanding why those 3 words felt strangely cold. She had never called me that inside our home. Not once. I assumed she was teasing me. That is formal, I said with a small grin. You have an early board meeting, she answered while placing the herbs beside the sink. I thought professional was appropriate. There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. She simply continued preparing tea for herself before quietly sitting near the window overlooking the water. Usually she would ask about my schedule or remind me to eat lunch between meetings. Sometimes she would slip a handwritten note into my briefcase because she knew I rarely remembered to take breaks. That morning she said nothing. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost organized. As I stood to leave, she looked up from her tea. Your driver is waiting. You are not going to tell me to drive safely? I joked. She tilted her head slightly, almost confused by the question. Your driver has an excellent safety record. Then she returned to her book. Distant. The board meeting consumed the rest of the morning. Contracts worth millions. Yet when I returned home just after 7, the dining room table had already been set for 2. Dinner was perfectly prepared. My favorite wine had been opened exactly 15 minutes before I arrived. Naomi stood as I entered, smiling with flawless courtesy. Good evening, Mr. Mercer. I hope your meetings were successful. It sounded less like a wife welcoming her husband home and more like the manager of an elegant private estate greeting an important guest. For the first time in years, I realized perfection could feel unbearably lonely. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so perfect that it became impossible to complain about anything without sounding unreasonable. Every morning my clothes were prepared before I woke up. Every appointment appeared on my calendar before I remembered to ask for it. Every meal arrived exactly when it should. Every light that I usually forgot to turn off had already been switched off before I noticed. Naomi had not become careless. She had become flawless. That should have made my life easier. Instead, it made the house feel strangely unfamiliar. One evening, I walked into my study and found a folder resting neatly in the center of my desk. Inside was a complete schedule for the following week, color-coded, organized, and signed at the bottom with 2 words that made me pause. Naomi Ellison, not Naomi Mercer. I stared at the signature longer than I should have. She had never signed her full maiden name since our wedding. I carried the folder into the kitchen where she was quietly arranging fresh flowers in a simple glass vase. The room smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon. Rain tapped gently against the windows again, almost as if the island itself refused to let the silence leave. You signed your maiden name, I said. She looked at the folder, then back at me with the same composed expression she had worn all week. Yes. I waited for an explanation that never came. Was that intentional? I finally asked. It was accurate. She answered before returning her attention to the flowers. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant, yet every word landed heavier than an argument ever could have. Later that night, one of my senior executives called to discuss an upcoming charity gala. Without thinking, I answered, "Let me ask my wife. She handles those details." The words left my mouth automatically because that had always been true. Naomi had quietly built relationships with donors, local organizations, and community leaders for years. She remembered birthdays I forgot, names I never learned, and conversations I never realized mattered. Would you mind organizing next week's gala? I asked. She closed the book gently before looking at me. Of course, Mr. Mercer. I frowned. You do not have to call me that. She smiled politely. I assumed professional boundaries would be more appropriate. Professional boundaries? I repeated. You said business arrangements last longer than feelings. She said it so softly that it almost disappeared into the crackling fire. I simply adjusted my expectations. She stood, walked past me, and paused at the doorway. I have already prepared the guest list, confirmed the caterer, and reviewed the seating plan. The folder is on your desk. Then she left the room. I never heard anger in her voice. I never saw tears in her eyes. She had not punished me by refusing to care. She had punished me by removing herself from every act of love while leaving every act of responsibility untouched. A few days later, one of the house staff quietly approached me before dinner. Sir, he said carefully, Mrs. Mercer has asked that all household requests come through the weekly schedule from now on. She said she does not want anything to be forgotten. Forgotten. The word echoed in my mind long after he walked away. Nothing had been forgotten. Every responsibility had been completed. Every promise had been honored. The only thing missing was the woman who used to do those things because she loved me instead of because they belonged on a schedule. By the second week, I stopped telling myself I was imagining it. Naomi had not become distant. She had become deliberate. Every gesture carried the same quiet precision she once reserved for showing affection, Only now, every act felt measured instead of heartfelt. She never forgot anything. She simply stopped adding the little things that could never be listed on a calendar. My favorite coffee still waited for me every morning, but it was never poured into the mug she knew I preferred. Dinner was always served exactly at 7, but she no longer sat across from me until I invited her, and even then she answered with a gentle smile that she had already eaten earlier. The music she used to play throughout the house had disappeared. The laughter that once drifted through the hallways had been replaced by the soft ticking of antique clocks I had never noticed before. It was astonishing how loud silence could become. One Thursday afternoon, I arrived home earlier than expected after a client canceled at the last minute. Naomi was in the sunroom overlooking the water with her laptop open, reviewing financial reports from the charitable foundation she had quietly managed for years. I realized I had never once asked how much work that organization required. I had simply assumed it functioned on its own, just as I had assumed so many other things in our life. She looked up as I entered. "You are home early, Mr. Mercer." "I am," I answered. "I thought maybe we could have coffee together." She smiled politely. "I have 20 minutes before my next conference call. That should be enough time." The sentence unsettled me more than I expected. She spoke as though she were scheduling a meeting with a business associate instead of spending time with her husband. We sat across from one another as rain rolled down the glass walls of the room. She stirred her tea quietly while I searched for something ordinary to say. "How is the foundation doing?" I asked. "Very well. Anything interesting happening?" "Several new scholarship applications arrived this week. We approved 12 families yesterday." I nodded, realizing I knew almost nothing about work she had dedicated years of her life to. The conversation ended there, not because she refused to continue, but because I had never learned enough about her world to ask a meaningful second question. A strange feeling settled in my chest. For years I believed I understood everything that mattered inside this house. Now I was sitting across from the woman I had married, discovering how little I actually knew. As she closed her laptop, she slid a neatly organized envelope across the table. "These are the household budgets for the next quarter. Vendor contracts have been renewed. Property maintenance has been scheduled. Insurance policies have been updated. Everything requiring your signature is marked with yellow tabs." I stared at the envelope. "You always handled these things." "I still do," she replied calmly. "I simply thought greater transparency would be appropriate between business partners." She stood, gathered her notebook, and paused before leaving the room. "Your conference with Boston begins in 30 minutes. I reminded your assistant this morning to move it to the larger screen in your office." Then she walked away with the same graceful confidence she had always possessed. I remained alone, looking at the envelope in front of me. Every page proved how completely she had cared for a life I barely noticed. For the first time, the house no longer felt like the place I had built. It felt like a world Naomi had quietly held together while I convinced myself I was the one holding everything in place. Success had always come with a schedule, and for years I believed nothing was important enough to interrupt it. That changed on a Tuesday morning when my assistant walked into the conference room holding a folder marked in red. The acquisition we had spent 6 months negotiating was finally ready for my signature. Investors had already flown into Seattle. Attorneys were waiting. Every executive around the table expected me to walk in, sign the documents, shake a few hands, and leave with another victory. Instead, my phone vibrated with a reminder that did not come from my assistant. It came from my own calendar. Dinner at home. 7 o'clock. The reminder surprised me because I had entered it myself the night before. I stared at it for several seconds before quietly closing the folder. "Reschedule the signing until tomorrow morning," I said. The room fell silent. One executive looked genuinely confused. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "The buyers are already here. Then they can stay one more night. This deal is worth $18 million. I nodded once. "It will still be worth $18 million tomorrow." Nobody argued after that, but the surprise on their faces followed me all the way to the parking garage. For the first time in my career, I had postponed business for something I could not explain with numbers. The drive back to Bainbridge Island felt unusually peaceful. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the roads lined with damp evergreens glowing beneath the evening sun. I arrived home before 6 o'clock. Usually the house greeted me with finished routines. Dinner already prepared, lights already on, everything already completed before I noticed it. This time I stepped into the kitchen while Naomi was still cooking. She looked over her shoulder, visibly surprised to see me standing there so early. "You are home ahead of schedule, Mr. Mercer." I canceled a meeting, I answered. She stirred the soup for another moment before asking politely, was something wrong? I hesitated. Months ago I would have answered without thinking. Business. Contracts. Deadlines. Instead I heard myself say, I wanted to have dinner with my wife. She remained still for only a second before quietly returning her attention to the stove. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Normally, I would have gone upstairs to answer emails while I waited. Instead, I rolled up the sleeves of my shirt and opened the cabinet beside her. Where do you keep the plates? She turned toward me with genuine confusion. You have never asked me that before. I smiled awkwardly. I suppose I should have. Together we set the table without another word. It felt strangely unfamiliar, like two people learning a dance they should already know. During dinner, my phone buzzed 3 different times. The screen lit up with calls from attorneys, board members, and investors. Without reading a single message, I turned the phone over and left it face down beside my plate. Naomi noticed immediately. You should answer that, she said calmly. It might be important. I looked at her instead of the phone. Right now, I am exactly where I chose to be. She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before taking another bite of dinner. It was the first crack I had seen in the perfect composure she had carried since that rainy evening. It was not forgiveness. It was not hope. It was simply surprise. After we finished eating, I carried both plates into the kitchen before she could stand. She watched quietly as I washed them one by one, clumsy enough to prove I had almost never done it before. When I finished, she handed me a towel without saying a word. As I dried the last plate, she finally spoke. You did not have to cancel your meeting. I placed the plate back into the cabinet and looked at her. Maybe not. I paused before continuing. But I should have done it years ago. For the first time since everything changed, Naomi did not answer immediately. She simply looked at me with an expression I could not quite recognize. It was no longer the polite distance of a business partner, yet it was not the easy warmth we had once shared either. It was something quieter, something far more honest. It was the look of someone waiting to see whether one decision was the beginning of a different life, or merely another promise that would disappear with tomorrow morning. One decision did not erase 7 years of habits. I understood that the following morning when I woke before sunrise and reached for my phone out of instinct. Overnight, more than 40 emails had arrived. My assistant had already rearranged the meeting I had postponed, and 3 executives were waiting for my approval before moving forward. Normally, I would have answered every message before leaving the bedroom. Instead, I locked the screen and placed the phone back on the nightstand. Downstairs, I found Naomi sitting at the kitchen island with a notebook open beside a steaming cup of tea. She looked up with the same composed smile that had become painfully familiar. Good morning, Mr. Mercer. I poured myself a cup of coffee before sitting across from her, instead of disappearing into my study. She noticed the choice immediately, but said nothing. For several quiet minutes, we listened to the rain tapping softly against the windows. Years ago, that silence would have felt comfortable. Now it carried every conversation we had avoided. Finally, I broke it. I have been thinking about what you said. She closed her notebook. Which part? That you adjusted your expectations. She nodded gently, inviting me to continue. I keep wondering when you stopped believing I could change. Naomi did not answer right away. She looked out toward the bay where the morning fog drifted slowly across the water. It was not one day, she said at last. It was hundreds of ordinary days. Her words settled quietly between us. Can you explain? I asked. Every time I wanted to tell you something important, and you answered another call. Every dinner you promised to be home, but arrived after I was asleep. Every walk we planned, but postponed. None of those moments ended our marriage. She looked back at me with calm honesty. They simply taught me not to expect you. I lowered my eyes. There was nothing unfair about what she had said. It was not an accusation. It was a memory. I thought I was providing everything, I admitted. You were, she replied softly. You provided security, comfort, and stability. You gave me a beautiful home. She paused before adding the sentence that stayed with me long after she spoke it. I just never felt like I lived there with you. I had negotiated impossible conversations with powerful people without ever losing my confidence, yet I could not find a single sentence strong enough to defend myself against the truth. After breakfast, my phone began ringing again. This time I answered it, listened for a few seconds, then said something my assistant had never heard before. Move every meeting after 5 o'clock to tomorrow. I will not be available tonight. He hesitated. Sir, the board expects you. Then the board can wait. I ended the call before he could respond. Naomi had heard every word. You do not have to keep proving a point, she said quietly. I shook my head. I am not proving a point. I looked directly at her. I am trying to become the man you thought you married. For the first time since that rainy evening, her expression changed. Not into forgiveness, and not into joy. It became thoughtful, almost cautious, as though she wanted to believe me, but had learned that hope was something to protect rather than give away freely. She stood and picked up her notebook. As she reached the doorway, she stopped without turning around. Real change is not measured by what you cancel, she said softly. It is measured by what you choose again tomorrow. Then she walked toward the front door to begin her day, leaving me alone with a lesson no business school had ever taught me. Winning one evening was easy. Becoming a different man every ordinary day would be the real test. Keeping one promise turned out to be easier than building a new way of living. The real challenge began the following week, when ordinary life returned with all of its familiar temptations. Every morning, another meeting appeared. Every afternoon, another client requested my attention. Every evening, another reason emerged to stay at the office just a little longer. For years, I would have accepted every invitation without hesitation. This time, I started asking myself a different question before answering any request. What will this cost me at home? The answer was not always measured in dollars anymore. One Thursday afternoon, my assistant rushed into my office carrying a stack of contracts. The investors from San Francisco have moved the dinner to tonight, he said. Everyone is already on their way. I looked at the clock. 5:15. For years, I would have nodded without even checking my schedule. Instead, I opened my calendar and saw a simple reminder I had typed several days earlier. Help Naomi prepare for the foundation fundraiser. There was no board expecting me, no audience, no financial reward. Just a promise that only one person would know if I broke. I closed the contracts. Tell the investors I will join them for breakfast tomorrow. My assistant blinked in disbelief. Sir, they specifically asked for tonight. Then tomorrow morning will be their second choice. 20 minutes later, I walked through the front door, carrying nothing except my briefcase. Naomi was standing in the dining room surrounded by seating charts, handwritten notes, and name cards for the fundraiser. She looked genuinely surprised. I thought you had meetings this evening. I did, I answered. I chose this instead. She studied my face for a long moment before quietly sliding one of the seating charts toward me. Then perhaps you can help me solve a small problem. For the next hour, she explained the guests, the scholarship recipients, and the families who would be attending. I listened carefully, occasionally asking questions instead of pretending I already understood. She smiled once when I remembered the name of a student she had mentioned several days earlier. It was a small smile, almost invisible, yet it felt more valuable than any business victory I had celebrated that month. As we worked together, my phone vibrated repeatedly inside my jacket pocket. I did not take it out. Eventually, Naomi looked up from the guest list. You can answer it if you need to. I slowly removed the phone, looked at the screen filled with missed calls, and then did something I had never done before. I switched it completely off and placed it on the table beside us. Tonight, I said quietly, the people calling me already know I exist. I looked at her before continuing. I realized the person sitting across from me has spent years wondering whether she mattered enough for me to notice. The room fell silent. Naomi lowered her eyes to the seating chart, tracing one finger along the edge of the paper before speaking. Do you know what hurt the most? She asked softly. I shook my head. It was never that you were busy. She looked at me with remarkable calm. It was believing I always came after whatever was keeping you busy. I felt every word settle into the quiet space between us. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No raised voices. No tears. Only the painful clarity of a truth that had waited years to be spoken aloud. When we finally finished preparing for the fundraiser, Naomi gathered the papers into neat folders and stood beside the window overlooking the bay. Thank you for staying, she said. I walked beside her and looked out across the dark water where the first lights from distant boats shimmered against the evening sky. I am beginning to understand something, I admitted. Love is not proven by the promises we make when life is easy. It is revealed by the choices we keep making when something else demands our attention. Naomi did not answer immediately. She simply nodded once, as though she had been waiting a very long time to hear me discover that truth on my own. The fundraiser took place on a cool Saturday evening overlooking Elliott Bay, and for the first time I attended not as the man whose name appeared on the invitation, but as the husband quietly standing beside the woman who had built the evening from the ground up. Throughout the event, I watched Naomi move effortlessly from one conversation to another. She remembered every volunteer by name. She greeted scholarship recipients as though they were family. Parents thanked her with genuine emotion. Elderly donors embraced her. Young students smiled the moment they saw her walking toward them. I had spent years believing I was the public face of our family. Standing there that night, I realized I had confused visibility with importance. At one point, an elderly gentleman approached me and extended his hand. "You must be Naomi's husband," he said warmly. "She has spoken so kindly of you over the years." The words caught me completely off guard. I smiled politely, but inside I felt something tighten in my chest. Even after everything, she had protected my reputation with people who mattered to her. She had never allowed my failures to become someone else's opinion of me. Later that evening, I quietly stepped away from the ballroom and wandered into a small office where volunteers had organized years of foundation records. While waiting for Naomi to finish speaking with the family, I noticed several storage boxes labeled by year. One volunteer smiled when she saw me looking. "Mrs. Mercer keeps everything," she said. "She says every student deserves to have their story remembered." Curious, I opened one of the older boxes. Inside were handwritten thank you cards, scholarship applications, photographs, and neatly organized folders. Tucked between two binders was a familiar leather notebook. I recognized it immediately. I had given it to Naomi on our first wedding anniversary, then forgotten about it almost as quickly as I had bought it. I opened it carefully. It was not a diary. It was a record of ordinary moments she had hoped we would someday share. One page simply read, "Adrian came home before sunset today. We watched the rain together for 12 whole minutes." Another said, "He remembered my favorite soup without asking." Months later, another entry read, "Canceled again. Maybe next week." Then another, "Dinner alone, but he sounded tired on the phone." Another, "He promised we would walk by the water after his meeting." The next page contained only 6 words. "He forgot." I did not remind him. I kept turning the pages until I reached the date of that rainy evening when everything had changed. There was no long paragraph. Only one quiet sentence written in careful handwriting. Tonight, I finally believed him. I closed the notebook immediately. For several moments, I could not move. The pain was not in reading what she had written. It was realizing that every page described opportunities one had been given without ever recognizing their value. I had spent years believing our marriage was sustained by the large things I provided, while she had built it almost entirely from small moments I repeatedly overlooked. When Naomi entered the office a few minutes later, she immediately recognized the notebook in my hands. She did not ask why I had opened it. She simply looked at me with quiet understanding. "I should not have read it," I said. She gently shook her head. "No." Her voice was soft but steady. "You should have lived it." Neither of us spoke again for several seconds. Finally, I looked at her and asked the question I had been afraid to ask since that rainy night. "After everything, why did you stay?" Naomi smiled sadly, though there was kindness in her eyes. "Because leaving would have been easier." She paused before continuing. "I stayed because I wanted to know whether the man I loved still existed beneath the life he had built." The answer left me standing in complete silence. For the first time, I understood that she had not been waiting for an apology. She had been waiting to see whether I would become someone capable of making one truly matter. Spring arrived quietly on Bainbridge Island, and with it came something I had spent years believing could be negotiated but never truly earned. Trust does not return because someone apologizes. It returns because someone keeps choosing the same promise on ordinary days when nobody is watching. The months that followed were filled with small decisions that would have seemed insignificant to anyone outside our home. I stopped scheduling meetings before sunrise because Naomi loved sharing coffee while the bay was still covered in morning mist. I no longer asked my assistant to remember birthdays or anniversaries because I wanted to remember them myself. When dinner was ready, my phone stayed in another room. The business survived every one of those changes. To my surprise, so did I. One rainy evening, I returned home carrying the leather notebook I had found after the fundraiser. I placed it gently on the dining table beside 2 empty coffee cups. Naomi walked into the room a few moments later and immediately recognized it. She looked at me, then at the notebook, waiting quietly. "I have been thinking about the last page," I said. "The one that said you finally believed me." She nodded. "I believed what you said because your actions had been saying the same thing for years." I slowly opened the notebook to that page before reaching into my jacket and removing a fountain pen. Beneath her final sentence, I wrote only one line. "I was wrong." Then I closed the notebook and slid it back toward her. "Not because I stopped loving you," I continued, Because I never understood what love was asking from me. Naomi looked down at the page for a long time without speaking. Finally, she closed the notebook, resting both hands gently on its cover. "Thank you," she whispered. "For reading it?" I asked. She shook her head. "For understanding it." The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt different. It no longer carried distance. It carried patience. A few days later, I walked into my office and canceled a recurring executive dinner that had occupied the first Thursday evening of every month for nearly a decade. My assistant looked at me with the same surprise he had shown weeks earlier. "Should I move it to another date?" he asked. I smiled. "No. Remove it permanently." "May I ask why?" I looked through the window toward the ferry crossing the Sound before answering. "Because I finally realized success is not measured by the meetings I attend. It is measured by the moments I almost missed." That evening I arrived home before sunset carrying nothing in my hands. No flowers. No expensive gifts. No carefully planned surprises. Naomi was standing on the back porch watching the rain drift across the water exactly as she had done countless times before. I joined her without saying a word. For several peaceful minutes, we simply listened to the rhythm of the rain striking the cedar roof. Then I quietly reached into my pocket and turned my phone completely off before placing it on the porch railing. Naomi noticed the gesture immediately. She smiled, not because of the phone itself, but because she understood what it represented. "No emergencies?" she asked gently. I smiled back. The only place I kept creating emergencies was in my own schedule. She laughed softly, the first completely unguarded laugh I had heard in what felt like years. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply real. I realized then that healing had never arrived through one grand apology or one unforgettable speech. It had returned one ordinary choice at a time. Before we went back inside, I turned toward her. "There is one thing I need to say." She waited. That night, I said our love was just another deal. I took a slow breath. I finally understand the truth. A deal only works when both sides expect something in return. You spent years giving without keeping score. I was the only one treating our marriage like a transaction. Naomi stepped a little closer. Her eyes filled not with certainty, but with quiet hope. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked toward the warm lights glowing inside the house we had shared for 7 years. "Tomorrow," I answered, "I choose you again." She slipped her hand into mine, gentle and unhurried, and together we walked back inside, not because our story had become perfect, but because we had finally learned that the strongest marriages are not built by people who never fail. They are built by two people who decide, every ordinary day, that love is worth choosing again before anything else.